Welcome to episode 202 of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. I am Dave Deacon, and have we got an episode for you? We talk with a pillar of the world of ecology and land management and a Regents Professor of Wildlife Conservation at Oklahoma State University, Dr. Sam Fullendorf, here in just a few minutes. We'll be covering a lot of interesting stuff in this episode, and you will be able to find out more information about what he covers on our website, reddirtagronomy.com. As always, we start with a quick trip around the table for an introduction to the dream team of dirt and all things that grow in it. Let's start with Oklahoma State University Extension Soil and Water Conservation Management Extension Specialist.
But at the same time, there was, some efforts to improve pollinator habitat and all that kind of stuff, and they were talking about planting all these exotic species, and I'm sitting here, it's like, why do we want to plant exotic species to facilitate native pollinator habitat?
Yeah. Dr. Jason Warren. Across from him, we find Oklahoma State University Extension Cropping System Specialist.
How in your career have you seen or dealt with the increasing interest of non-beef producers, I guess, or non-people that are wanting that production out of the land influence on what you're doing on a rangeland situation?
Dr. Josh Lofton. And next to him is Oklahoma State University Extension Precision Nutrient Management Specialist.
If we're producing forage in a range to be removed by cattle, I know it's redistributed, but there's what's eaten isn't always returned to the soil. It may be lofted off-site. I'm seeing more and more indication that a little P&K fertilization, especially in some of the ground that's been ran a little bit too hard, reduce stocking, get P&K, may not be a bad idea. Has there been any looking into that?
Dr. Brian Arnell. The doctors really do enjoy hearing from you and answering your questions, so if you have one about soil or crop production, jump on over to reddirtagronomy.com and leave your question there, or send an email directly, podcast@reddirtagronomy.com, and we will discuss your question on the next podcast. Since most crops are in dormancy this time of year, and we are knee-deep into conference season, we thought we would kick off the show with an update from some of those conferences with a guy that has logged more miles than a spy balloon floating over the United States. Of course, Dr. Brian Arnell. You are listening to the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast.
January, February is heavy extension, heavy CCA training, heavy crop advisor training. A lot of in-state meetings that will be set up either have happened or going on through January and February. A lot of Bermuda grass drought programs in the West, getting more of the wheat programs coming on throughout the state. But nationwide, I've had an opportunity to do a fair bit of travel outside the state. I was in Utah for a meeting. I was in Little Rock, working with the Arkansas Ag Association, Crop Consultant Association, was up talking to MFA in Missouri. So that's Missouri Farmer Association Ag Group, talking about biologicals, the products that are on the marketplace. We have Red River Crops Conference down in Texas, then to New Mexico for New Mexico Crop Consultant Association, and then really kind of turn in on the Oklahoma meetings, a lot of farmer organization, a lot of county, a lot of cool stuff out there that I've seen. I've been dealing with a lot of folks out of the Southeast more recently, talking to a lot of folks out of Mississippi, Louisiana, getting to learn about some of that black ground farming, really heavy dark soils, a lot of bedded farming down there. And so that was fun, and then getting to see what's going on in the Missouri agriculture sector, on how their wheat crop's handling, what they're moving in on some of that stuff and their forage production. So it's been a fun run, getting pretty road weary.
Well, and you're able to go learn from other folks, and from that, are you thinking of different opportunities here in Oklahoma to introduce some of that to Oklahoma farmers?
Yeah, so the Utah trip was pretty high-end ag, so it was a lot of startups. I got to hear about a lot of things that are probably 5 to 10 years out. Biotech-wise, there's some really cool things that could, I don't know if it'll happen, but could play out on the IPM side. What they're doing biotech-wise with, creating bacteria, kind of like the virus for sorghum headworm, but other things that it's very very specific on what you're attacking and how it attacks different insects. So it can be very, very specific. Also on the crop side, just crop genetics. A lot of talk on Ohio Lake soybean, how they're producing some really cool stuff I'd like to see happen in Oklahoma. Some folks that is very integrated system. So one farmer up in New York, very, very integrated. He's growing Ohio Lake soybean. He's growing non-GMO, conventional, a lot of stuff, and he's processing it for dairy up in that area. He's processing the meal himself so he can sell the Ohio Lake oils and then sell Ohio Lake bean meal, which doesn't have currently any of the upsell that Ohio Lake oil does. But he's now also got a biodiesel reactor in his plant. He's creating his own energy on some of his stuff, so they're using a lot of heat on that. A lot of the dairies also are using the methane production. There's a lot of talk about how they're capturing the methane and how that looks in the system, and then their waste output, how they're really processing the liquids and the dries and how that goes back in the system, either as a dry land application. So, and then just yesterday, just hearing a lot of talk about forages post-drought in Missouri, thinking about how we can apply some of that stuff. Their drought was a lot less than our drought, but still just that managing forages in an environment that our forages got kicked in the tail across the board. So how are we going to manage that, whether it's nutrient-wise, whether it's stocking density, whether it's some kind of weed control if need be, or a little bit of all of them.
You said post-drought. That implies that this drought might end?
Yeah.
Possibly?
Well, so that was actually a conversation. So the post-drought, you say post-drought, and so do we manage our forages in such a way where we're expecting another drought, or do we manage them so that if we can come out of this drought, they're better capable of, they have a better root system, they have better ability to take advantage of the moisture. And right now we have some moisture in some of the state, and so our grasses, our forages will start greening up. And so we need to make sure that, and it's a little bit late on some of the stuff. K management should have been applied post-dormancy so it can get into the roots, but getting phosphorus if you're low phos, so that you have that energy to create root growth and get that green up going. Because right now, in my mind, the importance on our forage system is getting a good root back in the system over forage production right now, is that we need to repair some of our grasses.
Talking about what Brian just talked about is we were just hearing that coming out of the last drought.
Right.
Folks were talking about in like 18 and 19 about recovering things to do on your pastures post-drought to recover those plants and make those perennials a little healthier and stuff like that. So the good thing is a lot of folks should have heard this not too far off, and I don't know if we're coming out of a drought, but it's good information to start, getting from the last time that we had a dry spell and kind of bringing it back to this is things we need to be doing in the next year or two. It's good information.
Well, and I go back to the drought of 11 and 12, and that was a pretty hardy drought, and there was a lot of talk back then of, do we manage our land as drought targeted, and then hey, we got a cool rain, let's take a breather, but then we go back and just prepare, just accept that we need to focus on doing this as a drier climate here in the state. So that's, what's your thoughts?
I don't know, and I think we have an expert in here that could probably speak better to that.
That's where we're going. Yeah.
From what I saw, it seemed like, and I think we talked about this on other podcasts, it seemed like some of the pasture was managed a little bit better this run, that they were a little bit easier on it. I saw less ground get hit really hard and stay on way too long before it was either unfortunately liquidated or moved off. But it seemed like we did have a little bit better handle on stocking density and management of that forages going into that heat. I just saw less ground that just looked like it was wore out.
I would agree. It just seems like people destocked a lot quicker, and it's good. Like I was in the Panhandle yesterday, and it's a freaking disaster out there.
Yeah.
They got 500s today, but
I saw that
I
picture.
guess.
You guys see the picture on Twitter where it was irrigated wheat versus dry land wheat
No.
out in the Panhandle. It was green versus nothing. I mean, that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And you want to go ahead and introduce our guest since we've kind of alluded to some of
Yeah.
his areas of study.
We've actually been trying to get this guy on for a while now because we just assumed that the conversation with him would go well. But I'll let him introduce what he does, his title. But it's Dr. Sam Fullendorf, and he's been running around all of us. He's seen all of us go through this system and has had to put up with this in one shape or form or the other.
He educated me.
He educated.
Like I took class from him. He's one of the few left around that I took class from.
That's right.
Yep.
I remember.
How can you forget?
You were the best student I ever had.
Shit.
That he remembers.
That I remember.
Yeah.
In this room, yeah.
In this room.
So I guess Sam, tell us kind of your background, what your area of study, and what you've been doing at OSU.
Great. My area of study, I'm a rangeland ecologist and range management, and I basically study grazing, woody plants, fire, wildlife, basically anything rangeland focused. In Oklahoma, rangelands, it's not as simple as saying I only work on rangelands because it's kind of a gray area where rangelands stop and where introduced pastures take over. So there's a little bit of wiggle room on that side, and then the same thing's true on the forestry side. So while I'm not a forester, there's a lot of trees on a lot of the places I study and work, and so some of these are artificial boundaries on what we work on, but basically I work mostly with grazing land in Oklahoma, and I've been here since 1997. So couple years, yeah, and I love it here. So I enjoyed working. I started in the agronomy department, then it became plant and soil sciences, and now I'm in natural resource ecology and management. I've enjoyed every one of those departments. I learned a lot when I was in agronomy and plant and soil sciences that was different than what I was trained, but I really enjoyed my time there.
So take us back. Why did you choose this area to study rangeland?
Do you mean Oklahoma, or do you mean just the field? Yeah. So when I had an interest in agriculture and the world I lived in. So I went to undergraduate school at OkState University in West Texas. So if you're in agriculture in that area, it's going to be rangelands with a few exceptions. So I got my undergrad degree there, piddled around and worked a little bit after I got out of school, and then I went back to graduate school in range, specifically at Texas A&M. But I got here as quick as I could, and but I think part of the challenge, the fun of rangelands, is that it's very much a critical part of agriculture, but it's also people use rangelands for more than just agriculture. So, and I don't mean just agriculture like that's trivial. I just mean there's a lot of people with diverse interests on how they manage their land, and some of it, everything from hobby to real productive rangeland grazing systems. So,
you said something I've always been kind of curious about. Rangeland, as you move, how far east does range go?
Yeah.
When you transition from range to...
That's a great question. And, just academically, if that matters, it really probably doesn't. But basically, it's we're one of the easternmost schools that has a range program. So it's mostly rangelands west of here. There's a few exceptions. Florida and Louisiana, some of the southern states have range professionals, but they don't really very often have an academic program in range. So you pretty well have to go to the western states. So that's a great question.
So is it a rainfall? Is it a plant species? Is it just how it's managed? What?
Yeah, that's great. So it's rainfall's part of it. So basically what we have, so basically really good rangeland was mostly cultivated early on because it was also really good cropland. Yeah. So we're mostly left with drier sites that are, and maybe rocky, lots of slope, places like the Flint Hills in Osage County. The only reason there's tallgrass prairie up there is because they burn it a lot, and there's a lot of rocks, and that really. So mostly rainfall, but some soil texture and depth related things.
So like what we were talking earlier about the drought recovery plan or whatever. I mean, what's your thoughts on like what the rangeland looks like right now as a result of what we've been going through? And then what do you think about if we are going to start getting rain, or the guys down at OU were saying the crop school that we might hopefully be going at least into a neutral cycle with the oceanic
I heard that repeated this week. So that neutral trend seems to be at least holding for now.
Yeah, I think what y'all were talking about made a lot of sense, and I think I agree entirely. I do think this drought seems like maybe it's more about the cattle markets and stuff that allowed people to adjust more quickly, or maybe it's just that we had that drought in 2012 that was as bad as it was. But I do feel like it was better this year. Some of what you talked about is almost a principle of range management. I mean, since most of the range professions are west of here, dealing with drought is a big part of the rangeland profession, and in fact, a large part about figuring out how many animals to have and so forth is built on the idea of being really cautious toward we're always starting the next drought, or it's just around the corner. And the idea that you could stock for a wet year or you can stock for a dry year, and how that translates out whether it's wet or dry, and the gain and risk and all of that involved, I think is a really important part. And it's really interesting here because we have really productive rangelands that can produce a lot of beef, but that puts you at a high risk to lose a lot of money if it's a bad year as well. So
what have you seen, whether it's in the profession or just in application? What's it looked like in your career? Has it changed the approach to rangeland management, the philosophy of it? What's that looked like over the last 20 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's changed, as you would imagine. When I started, when I was in graduate school, they told me there was nothing left to learn about grazing, and that basically it was pretty well all we knew it all. And I'm glad that wasn't true, or else I would have had a long, slow career. But I do think it was kind of true under a lot of assumptions that were around at that time. But now there's a lot of interest in people managing rangelands for everything from water to soils to wildlife, and so it's just changed where what we want off of our rangelands are different than what it was 30, 40 years ago. There's still plenty of people out there that want to get production off of rangelands, but there's an increasing level of people wanting to also do hunting and also do things with soil carbon and other things. So that's probably the biggest change.
Well, You said something whenever you were making your introduction, is that a lot of people, and you kind of alluded to it, there are a lot of people, and I think even more than agricultural production or crop production or what have you, have interest or vested interest in rangeland. Like, how in your career have you seen or dealt with the increasing interest of non-beef producers, I guess, or non people that are wanting that production out of the land influence on what you're doing on a rangeland situation?
Well, it's really interesting. That's a great question, and a good example of that would be cedar. So everybody loves to hate cedar, and that's a fun thing to get angry at. But initially, what we did was a lot of research on cedar, and we showed that it was decreasing livestock production. That was some of the first things that we showed, which is fairly easy to demonstrate and not too hard to imagine. But one of the things of interest was that since often the solution is something that scares everyone, like fire, then we also have to get the citizenry that may not own land on board before we start lighting the country on fire. And so one of the things that I noticed was that they're very much engaged on some of those topics, but they may not care as much about its effect on livestock production. But it also has a lot of other effects as well, including things related to wildlife, but also pollen production. We just finished a study where there's a lot more ticks. When you get an area invaded with cedar trees, you get a flurry of an explosion of ticks, and many of those are the ones that carry diseases that we don't want. So a lot of these non-production related questions are really valuable in getting sort of the community at large to be supportive of us doing some kind of management on that'll benefit agriculture, but it'll also affect other things.
Yeah, because I was at a meeting just this last Friday, and Secretary Arthur was talking, and the whole thing when everybody comes out of a drought in rangelands, like we got too many cedars, we got too much salt cedar, and then further south we got too much mesquite. We just got to work. What are you doing to get that? And she's like, well, you got to also do the thing that you have some landowners that just find those aesthetically pleasing.
It's true.
And you property rights are property rights, and if you want property rights, then you have to agree that some folks that use that for just hiking or just going out and getting in the country, if you will, and just trying to escape might enjoy that. And so, like, on y'all's things that have been trying to get things like salt cedar and eastern red cedar and mesquite and all that out, like how do you I don't want to say deal, because that would be a wrong term, but how do you work with folks that want to see an increase in some of those things you've been working to get out? I mean, I guess what you just said, the pollen management, everybody hates pollen, and everybody hates ticks. So I mean, I guess that's one thing, but I mean, do you work with them on like alternative things that are good? You like the eastern red cedar because it's dark red and always green and it's clumpy. So here's an alternative.
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of things have changed. A lot of land is being purchased for just recreation, and they may want to run some cows, but they're actually mostly interested in just the recreational value. And sometimes there's an increase in absentee landowners, and oftentimes they're not as engaged, although there's exceptions to every rule. So it's changing pretty quickly. And I basically am well aware and see it every day that many landowners don't want to control or to go to the trouble. They may hate cedar, but they're not going to stop it. And it's one of the difficult things I've watched in my career, because I started in West Texas where the war was already over, arguably. And when I left there, everyone was saying, well, this could have been a grassland if we would have started, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I got to Oklahoma and it was much better shape, but now it's a lot like Texas was Kansas is even a lot like Texas was, and it's even moving up into Nebraska. So I think realistically, it's not going to be that we're going to turn every grassland back into grassland and hold it there for a really long time. In fact, I suspect those will be the exceptions more than the rule. But there are places where there's strongholds of people that are really focused on managing that problem. So it's interesting because we've known how to manage it for a long time, but it's just social, and it's just a limitation on what people are willing to have happen in their environment.
Is because I've heard this, and I don't think it's right, but is there any value on these invasive species when it comes to the wildlife?
Yeah, that's a fun question. So first of all, with invasive species, we have native invasives, and then we have exotic invasives, and so
just eastern red,
eastern red cedar and mesquite.
Yeah.
So there's some cover value for some wildlife. I mean, but mostly one of the things we did, I believe it was John Weir, I may be wrong about this, but somebody some years ago did a study where they looked at deer habitat versus hunter habitat. And they found that the hunters liked something different from what the deer liked. And so I think hunters like to have some trees around, but I'm not sure that the deer really follow that recommendation all that much. So they haven't read those papers, maybe. But so there's minimal value, and it sort of depends on what wildlife species we would want. So, you can find all kinds of exceptions. A full maximum growth forest of mesquite or cedar really has very little value for much of anything. So, there may be a few birds that live in and that prefer those kind of habitats, but it's mostly limited to real common species.
Mesquite firewood is it better for barbecue than, say, pecan or one of the other woods?
Well, since I grew up in West Texas, burning a mesquite is good any time of the year for any reason.
Throw in the word barbecue and you're set.
Yeah.
You've been a part of some of the research up at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve up north of Pawhuska. Mm-hmm. Talk about the patch burning and the science behind that. Why you've seen some of the results that you have.
When I first got here, there was lots of discussion about, well, how can we come up with a management approach that will kill trees and provide a lot of the ecosystem services, but still be able to produce a substantial amount of beef. And patch burn grazing is what we came up with at the time. And it's there's nothing magical about it other than sort of the fun part of the study was I was fortunate to be able to work at the preserve, and I was able to work in cattle pastures that were for production, but then I was also able to work in the bison unit where it was random fire and free roaming bison. So from that, we learned that bison prefer, if you allow them to forage anywhere, they'll forage in areas that are most recently burned.
Okay.
So we took that and thought, well, can we use that in a cattle production standpoint? And so we on part of that property as well as some of OSU's property, we started trying to burn portions of pastures, just let animals select wherever they want. And the advantage is the animals graze heavily on the highest quality forage, which is the most recently burned. Other areas within the same pasture are accumulating fuel so that they'll be able to burn, and it's mostly fine fuels that are prone to burn anyway. And so it's sort of a rotational system, but it's multiple years before something gets grazed again. So the idea is to integrate fire and grazing back in, and part of the argument is that if you're doing range management and then you have a brush problem, it's almost like, well, you've got to put down the cattle management and go pick up your brush killing tools, kill all the brush, and then try and figure out a way to get the cattle back into that. So we wanted a system that was sort of all built in together, where it would address the woody plants but also allow production to continue.
I got the opportunity years ago, back in the TV days, to do a story on the greater prairie chicken, and we, of course, we had to be there at like before dawn. We got there at like 4 a.m. Took us way out into this area where they were trying to gather the greater prairie chicken, and I still remember the researcher taking us out there, and he said, "Oh man, they did it." And I said, "What?" And they had nets and fence up to gather the prairie chicken. He said the bison ruined the nets. And I said, "Okay, well, just tell us where we need to go." He said, "Okay, you need to go over to that blind over there." So we went in there, and as we're walking, he claps about 5 times. You just barely see the sun. Or a bit of the dawn coming up, and after he clapped, there were mounds that stood up, and that was the bison that were all laying in that area. And I'm getting goosebumps again. It's one of my favorite stories to tell, because they go where obviously where they can graze, but the greater prairie chickens are a part of that also. Yeah. Talk about them as kind of the canary in the coal mine to kind of gauge.
Okay, yeah. So if you burn a patch, grazing animals, bison, cattle, elk, horses, they'll congregate on those recently burned areas. And when they do, that creates an area with really short green grass that's like a putting green almost. And right next to it will be an area that has accumulated fuel. Well, from a chicken's perspective, they do their breeding display where they can be highly visible on this really short grass, but then they have to nest where there's plenty of cover. So they really need a place that's bare right next to a place that has really tall vegetation. So the only way you can really get that is to have something like this that's managing the landscape so that you've got different conditions across the region. And related, the just songbirds that occur in each of those patches that are variable will be completely different. So you'll also have different songbirds, different small mammals, different. So essentially, the animals are responding to the same kind of pattern that they probably have responded to for a really long time.
I assume that like quail and pheasant kind of do the same thing, because they need that variable architecture for all their kind of systems.
Yeah, and they're less so. I mean, the chicken is a really good story because it really needs the extremes, whereas pheasants and quail often one end of the spectrum or the other is a little more important to them, so they're not kind of using all of it necessarily, but they definitely need multiple vegetation types. So you're in the same. It's the same. You're right.
Because when I was an undergrad working at the Prairie, that was everybody's. We don't want to bring fire and grazing in because it'll hurt our quail and our pheasant population.
Right.
And that ended up being not true.
Right.
I assume.
Right. Yeah. Right. And there are some Oklahoma Department of Wildlife properties that use similar management, and their primary objective might be quail or something different. So,
how do when you're in, we've talked about the value of fire. In the act of fire, how do the animals react? I've always been curious about how that movement is and what it's like when a fire is set. How do the chickens react? How do the bison react, and all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to say about chickens and quail. And I have observed them quite a bit, but one of the interesting things about the grazing animals is they'll go to the fire. So, and it's still smoking, and they're on it, and I always jokingly point out when I give talks, I'll often use a slide of a Bambi and it's a picture of the terror from the wildfire that caused by the hunters, and then I put right after it a picture of cows out here west of town on Stillwater, and they're actually walking into the fire, and it's not quite it's a sort of contrast Bambi from cows in Stillwater, and I think everybody's shocked to know that Bambi's not a documentary. I'm sure, right? It seems like the wildlife are really well adapted to fire for the most part. I remember being on Boone Pickens' property once, and we were doing a burn, and one quail got killed by the fire, and I'd never seen that before. So we went and got the dead bird, and it happened to have a radio collar on it. So the argument was it may have been the last one to get up and try and fly away, and the radio collar may have added a little bit of weight that just kept it at the back end. But that's the only bird I've ever seen.
Talk about how producers can introduce a better management of their land through not just fire, but other ways of doing it. Because we just bought some land, and we've been trying to bring it back. And I knew a family a mile to the south of us, and she was 90 years old, scared to death of fire.
Sure.
Did not because back in 1950 there was a fire coming across the prairie, and it almost got her.
Sure.
But, all those years later, she was not going to burn, and now that land has just been overtaken.
Yeah.
So fire is one way, but what are some other ways that people can effectively manage their land?
So if you're talking about woody plants, then they, generally it's fire, mechanical, herbicide, or biological. And one of the things that we are doing as well is we have a study out west of town where we've added goats in the mix of our cattle, trying to reduce the amount. Really, the way I think of it is, we're probably still going to have to burn on those pastures, but if we could just burn less often and have it less of a dire effort, that might help. So from a cedar standpoint, the problem is that there's really not many good chemicals for controlling eastern red cedar. So from a mesquite standpoint, there's some pretty good chemicals. From a mechanical standpoint, that's just about money. It just costs a lot, and lots of people use it. But it really is expensive, and it's hard to recapture that money once you spend it. So by far, fire is probably the most economical way that can be profitable. But even that, the big thing is to start control before you need to control. So in other words, if you're trying to control a property that already has a cedar problem, then it's really too late. And I mean, there are things you can do, but it's just going to cost a lot. And you're better off trying to manage it before you even have a problem, which is a bit of a challenge to get people to think about.
Have you seen an attitude change over the years from the producers who used to, well, I'm not going to, it's just my land, I'm just going to let it do whatever, to maybe, hey, how can we make this better for wildlife, for agriculture, for just folks living out there?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's changed fairly dramatically, and a lot of it has to do with some of these fire cooperatives and so forth. But there's a lot of people that all of a sudden seem to care about how land is managed, and that's even bigger difference that is, I hope, in the long run, positive. We'll see.
Oh yeah, when you get into the fire, can you mention, because it does reset some of the ecological succession on that, and for a long time they were, all I heard was, fire just set you back at the beginning of a succession, but that's not entirely true. It's important to have those old successional, those old trees. Even setting fire to that kind of that mixed ground is really important to keeping those old trees happy. And prairie health is kind of what I'm getting to. It's important to kind of have those mixed successional things, and fire is probably the best at doing that. Correct?
Right. I think you're exactly right. So fire often gets talked about just as brush control, but it's actually more than that. And if you let it interact in space with grazing, like the patch burning sort of scenario, it's really that variation in vegetation structure that you get around a pasture that is really important, and that's basically what rangelands are.
When you talked about that you do a little forestry, it's important in understory management and stuff like that as well, because usually if you don't clear out some of the understory, by the time you get to it, it's just weedy plants, essentially low quality, low importance, low value plants that end up going into a heavy understory. So it's not just prairie, it's also that mixed area and into our forest area.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, the cross timbers ecoregion of Oklahoma is arguably the largest and arguably the most neglected. So it's like it's either converted into something trying to be more useful, or it's just abandoned almost, and maybe used for deer hunting, but most likely for building houses. But cross timbers, if you don't manage it, it's going to not be worth very much from an agricultural or wildlife standpoint. But you can manage it, and it can actually be very productive.
Yeah.
So as we start looking at land areas, we have a lot more ground that's cut up. We don't have people running. Well, we do, but we don't. The land sizes. What's the smallest unit that you could consider doing patch burn graze on? I mean, are we talking 100-acre person could do that, or does it need to be thousands of acres?
Well, it's a great question. We've done it down to 100 acres, and it works. Now, it's not going to bring prairie chickens back, but it's basically capable of getting the grazing animals to focus on the burned area and accumulate fuel elsewhere so that you can get another fire and keep the system going. So you can do that, and I suspect you could probably do it even smaller. But a lot of the benefits, especially the wildlife-related benefits, are not going to happen. Yeah. And basically, a prairie chicken may need 20,000 acres. So,
yeah.
So,
well, I was just thinking, so like on the Deacon Ranch, where I mean, Dave's not. You didn't purchase 2,500 acres, did you?
Just under. It was closer to about 70.
Okay. Yeah. As he's getting into his management and he wants to bring cattle and livestock on, in that smaller owner, it's not all about, you're not going to get rich off of your 70 acres.
Although
but
that's what we told the bank.
You don't, absolutely.
yeah.
You do want to manage it. You're coming out of cedars. You want to manage it with grazing. So could you do a patch burn on a 70-acre property?
You can. At some point, I guess one of the challenges is that if you have a piece of property and you need it all burned, then the last thing you want to do is cut it up and just burn a piece of it. Yeah. And so one of the challenges is that I guess one of the things I've tried to argue is that you may have to do something different to begin with. Yeah. But the goal would be to eventually be able to get something like the patch burn grazing model. And that would be a great maintenance tool that you could just get production, and you're not going to have an issue with trees in the future. But you probably have to be much more aggressive initially.
Yeah. Well, and to that end, we started with like 25, 26 acres of cedar trees on one area, and a buddy of mine let me borrow his bulldozer, and we wiped them all out. We had 8 burn piles and got rid of all those. And on the other side of the land, it's not great grazing grass, but we're trying to bring it back. And so we've actually talked about burning in patches and trying to allow the cattle to have a little bit of okay forage while we're trying to renovate some of the other areas too. So, I'm leaning on all of those videos I did years ago and talking with a lot of the folks to do that. But, with 70 acres, we're going to do maybe a 10-acre patch and try to do that. And it is really focusing on the long game, not so much the short game.
Well, it took us, 100+ years to screw it up. So, so maybe it'll take us a little while to get it back.
Yeah. Well, and you talked that you kind of do that all along, including some introduced forages. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our landowners in Oklahoma have native prairie right next to, Bermuda patches or something like that. So does that ever cause, do you have to do an extra bit of management when you do, you are managing that cattle to go on Bermuda and in the native? Like how do you kind of do that? What are the challenges, and I guess how do you overcome them?
Yeah, well that's definitely a challenge if there's like Bermuda grass in the same pasture and especially if like the Bermuda grass is fertilized, then that can certainly affect animal behavior. I guess generally most often they're not in the same pasture. And so then
usually like side by side.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then you can just manage the native separate from the introduced. But the introduced stuff is probably not appreciated enough by range people because but it's got a lot of value. Don't tell some of my colleagues I said that. But they especially you take Bermuda grass or even Old World Bluestem, and if you're in a drought and you have to destroy something, it doesn't really get destroyed. Mm-hmm. So it'll come back better than some of the native will. So there's some people have worked a lot at sort of using the combined effect of those as an opportunity instead of viewing it totally as a challenge. But it's definitely different. I mean, one of the things that I think we found is that unpalatable plants, when you burn them, they're more palatable. And, that's mostly true. I'm sure it's not true all the time, but it's most of the time that is true. And so using that as a tool, I think we barely scratched the surface of how you could actually make this work really well in some of those settings. So I don't know that there's an easy way to overcome the mixture. I mean, there's hardly a pasture in Oklahoma that it doesn't have Bermuda grass and Old World Bluestem in it somewhere. So
I guess that brings me to kind of the next part of that is, it's a lot of interest in the last couple of years, and probably much more beyond that, but it's just been talked about, of interseeding native pastures, interseeding introduced pastures, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And then once again, going back to your specialty, that patch burning, like how is that incorporated, and how is that a challenge maybe in that patch burning system?
Yeah, and we haven't actually interseeded intentionally, but we have done patch burning on properties where it has been interseeded in the past. So there is some discussion of that. One of the challenges with the interseeding thing is that some of these forage plants, they're selected to be able to tolerate really heavy grazing grown in a monoculture. So if all of a sudden it drops into a native prairie, it's got these traits to tolerate really heavy grazing and do really well. It's probably going to do really well, and it's probably going to become invasive. And it shouldn't be a big surprise that they do become invasive, because when you start thinking about the individual plant traits, so like Old World Bluestem sends its seed head up really quickly early in the year and gets reproductive and produces seed really fast, whereas the natives may take a little bit longer. Well, that's an advantage. So if you get that in the system, you have to think about trying to minimize that advantage. So the other one in Oklahoma's Sericea lespedeza, and it produces tannins, which cows don't like. But when it's small, it doesn't produce as much. So one of the ways with this patch burnt grazing, if we can burn a patch and the animals congregate on that patch and just keep it short, then they can get more use out of it. So, but I think one of the problems is, one of the things that scares me about introducing interseeding, I'm sure you could do that with some plants, but to do it with some that would become really invasive would be a bad idea.
Because you did some of that, like trash farming, if you will, I think is what you ended up calling it several years ago, correct? You put the cover crops and various species and some introduced semi-rangeland.
Yeah, most of any time I would have been doing that, I would have tried to keep it in Bermuda grass or fescue or something like that. I've never really thought about putting it into like native pasture or anything, because I'm like Sam. We've got enough damn invasive species that can roll over everything. And that's what, even, years ago, one thing, there was a concept that people were throwing out there, and there's like farming with nature, right? And that was one of the concepts that was first discussed when they were cover cropping. And then they moved that, talking about that in pastures. I'm like, I can kind of see that if you're wanting to try to bring a Bermuda grass field back to similar something to nature. But at the same time, there was, some efforts to improve pollinator habitat and all that kind of stuff. And they were talking about planting all these exotic species. And I'm sitting here, it's like, why do we want to plant exotic species to facilitate native pollinator habitat?
Yeah.
Right? And so it really kind of, and that was one of my biggest, at least one of my concerns is all these different things we're moving in here with all these names from other continents around the world. And in general, we bring plants that are aggressive and productive. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially exactly what an invasive species can be, is aggressive and productive.
Yeah,
and so it's very scary.
When I teach, I put up traits of a good weed out of a weed science book. Not good weed, but a good weed. So just
something.
Weed. Yeah. But then I put them up next to traits from a forages book that we go to look for plants, and they're identical.
Yeah.
And so when we introduce these plants, sometimes we're introducing a designer weed that's adapted to the system and able to tolerate a lot of what we do generally on these lands. Sometimes that can be really good. The cool thing about Bermuda grass is it'll sit there, and as long as, if you don't want it, you don't fertilize, and you won't have it. And if you do, you will. And but many of these plants aren't as sensitive to the amount of nitrogen available as Bermuda grass.
All right, so I'm going to go and you may also. You may agree or disagree, but if you agree, you may upset your fellow rangeland specialist. I'm feeling more and more as we look at some of our rangeland pasture systems, as we look at maybe how it's been managed for the last 30 or 40 years, which in some places I feel like the management's intensified too much. Mm-hmm. That at some point we may need to consider fertilization on the P&K side, not nitrogen side, but the P&K side, because we're removing, there's a mass balance in the system of removal and what's in there. And in a range system, I get nitrogen being low because that brings too many invasives. But P&K, if we're producing forage in a range to be removed by cattle, I know it's redistributed, but what's eaten isn't always returned to the soil. It may be lofted off-site. Sure. I'm seeing more and more indication that a little P&K fertilization, especially in some of the ground that's been ran a little bit too hard, reduce stocking, get P&K, may not be a bad idea. Has there been any looking into that on the range side?
Very limited. So there was a lot done, I want to say in the 60s and the 70s, of fertilizing rangelands. And, sort of just done, I don't mean haphazardly, but it was basically done just without going a deep dive. And the general argument was that it's hard to make pay. So you've got an extra cost, and some of the plants do better. And, I used to buy hay for my daughter's horse from a guy who had a native hay meadow, and he fertilized it. And he said that OSU said it wouldn't pay. And I was loading bales into my pickup and paying him the same thing as I would pay somebody who didn't fertilize there. So I think there's some truth to that. But that said, the P&K thing separately, and then also at what point, and especially when you view that these systems, if it was a native prairie at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve that was in great shape, I would say it's probably not a viable solution.
And that wouldn't be what the region is.
Right. But if it's somewhere where it's hard to tell the difference between native and pasture, and the lines are blurred, I think there's more that should be done there. And we haven't done enough of studying that. And when I look at, a lot of Oklahoma's go back country, and a lot of that is pretty low in nutrients. And, some of it has been in grass for a long time, and it's sort of just stuck.
And that's the problem I had is you said exactly. It's go back, which means it was farmed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not native soil as it was 3,000 years ago,
right.
2,000 years ago. It has been plowed.
Right.
It was beat up.
Yeah.
And it's go back because it got beat up.
Yeah, and we did a study when I first got here, and I was looking for studies to do so that I could get tenure. I basically went out to Clemmy out by Clinton, and there was old farmland right next to stuff that had never been plowed, and some of it had been heavily stocked, some of it had been lightly stocked, etc. But it was basically a perfect on-the-ground experiment, and so we just got with Highland and did soil samples and did some nutrients. And the interesting thing is, at that site, things that had been in grass for 30 or 50 years were just stuck, and they were lower carbon, lower nitrogen, and not very productive. And one of the things I was going to do was follow up with a study and look at how we could kickstart it, but I never got around to it.
Even 200, 300 years ago, we kind of messed things up when it comes to the balance of the prairie, and we're trying now to find ways to make it work again in a natural standpoint, but then also while we're here also, and that's it's an ongoing game.
Yeah, and there's a lot of viewpoints out there to where everything we've ever done was wrong, to everything we've ever done was right, and everything in between, and the answer's probably somewhere in the middle. But I do think the world's changing, and we have to get ecosystem services off of these lands as well as agricultural productivity, and trying to find ways to do both of those is a good thing to do, in my opinion.
You use the word ecosystem. Now, that's just define for the listener what an ecosystem is.
So the textbook definition is the biotic plus the abiotic. So the biotic community of an area plus the soils and the climate and all of that. So it's basically sort of a unit that we could think about, whether it's cropland or urban land or wildland. It's a system where you've got soils, nutrients, energy flowing, and basically everything that's living and everything that's not living. So That's the primary definition.
It's the big picture,
Right.
How things interact with other things also.
Right.
Dr. Sam Follendorf, thanks for joining us on the podcast today. And it's always great to kind of hear about what.
You can't look at Josh.
You're
when
right.
You're
I
speaking.
can't. I'm just gonna. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'll even pot him down. That's what I do because I can. I can do that. But thanks for coming in and helping us kind of talk about your research and what you've done for the state of Oklahoma over the years.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening in on this conversation of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. And if you'd like to join the next discussion, just send us an email, podcast@reddirtagronomy.com, or send us a tweet. Our handle is reddirtag. We would like to thank Dr. Sam Follendorf for joining us on this podcast. And to find out more about him or any of our guests, along with any of the resources that they talk about on the podcast, visit reddirtagronomy.com. There you will find show notes and you can listen to past episodes too. For Dr. Josh Lofton, Dr. Jason Warren, and Dr. Brian Annell, I am Dave Deacon, and we all want to thank you for listening in. The proceeding is a copyrighted recording of Ag Now Media, LLC 2023. And yes, all rights are reserved.